Let's examine respiratory adjustments to exercise as well as adjustments to high altitude conditions. So what adjustments to breathing rate and depth are made during exercise? So it turns out that the respiratory centers in the brainstem receive input from skeletal muscles, tendons, as well as joints. Respiratory rates and patterns change due to the anticipation and perception of exercise, not because the body is oxygen deprived. So we see that adjustments to breathing rates are often geared toward intensity and duration of exercise. So the term we use for these increases in breathing rate and depth during exercise is hypernia, which describes increased ventilation rates, so that is both minute ventilation rate and alveolar ventilation rate, due to metabolic needs. Minute ventilation and alveolar ventilation rates often increase to 10 to 20 times greater than their resting values. So note that hypernia is different than hyperventilation, whereas hyperventilation is excessive ventilation that is not due to metabolic needs. Hyperventilation often causes low partial pressures of CO2 in the blood and respiratory alkalosis as a result. With hypernia, the partial pressures of oxygen, the partial pressure of CO2, as well as blood pH remain surprisingly constant due to adjustments and fine-tuning of pulmonary ventilation with exercise. So we see that ventilation increases abruptly at first, and then it increases gradually, until finally reaching a steady state to sustain that particular intensity and duration of exercise. During or after exercise, muscles often feel fatigued because of the limitations in cardiac output, or the muscle's limited ability to use oxygen efficiently. This fatigue is typically not caused by inadequacies of the respiratory system. So what happens after exercise? We see that the respiratory rate eventually returns to its baseline rate as CO2 delivery to the lungs decreases. Anaerobic respiration, that is when the primary source of ATP is a process called glycolysis, tends to lead to the formation of lactic acid. And lactic acid is a waste product that must be eliminated from the body. So typically, glycolysis in the muscles and in active tissues is due to the fact that cardiac output is insufficient, which results in periods of temporary ischemia or low blood flow to muscles and tissues, which limits the muscle's ability to use the oxygen that is being delivered to it. And muscles, we also see, have a very limited ability to increase their oxygen uptake. So we see that anaerobic respiration typically results from ischemia, that is poor blood flow, or muscles' inability to increase their oxygen uptake. It is typically not due to poor respiratory function. So adjustments to respiratory rates also must be made in order to compensate for changes in altitude. So in particular, we see that these changes are usually following an increase in altitude. So recall that that altitude and atmospheric pressure are inversely related to one another. So as one goes up in altitude, atmospheric pressure will decrease. While going down in altitude, we see an increase in atmospheric pressure. Because of the low atmospheric pressure at high altitudes, we see that the partial pressure of oxygen will decrease as one goes up in altitude. This is what Dalton's law of partial pressures tells us. We see that there are short-term adjustments to altitude, and these are the changes in breathing rates, typically in the hours and days after going to high-altitude locations. The most obvious adjustment is an increase in minute ventilation. So both the rate and depth of breathing are often increased in order to increase minute ventilation rates. So often these adjustments increase minute ventilation by rates, or minute ventilation rates by roughly 3,000 milliliters per minute more than we see at rest at sea level. The body is also capable of long-term adjustments to living at high altitudes. It's a condition which is referred to as acclimatization to high altitude. So these adjustments typically come in the form of increased hematocrit. So recall that the kidneys produce a hormone called EPO, which targets the red bone marrow and stimulates the red marrow to increase production of red blood cells. This causes an increase in the total red blood cell count as well as increases in hematocrit. And we typically refer to this as secondary polycythemia, which was increased hematocrit as a result of living at high altitudes. We see that professional endurance athletes, so for example, elite marathon and ultramarathon runners, will often live and train at high altitudes in order to take advantage of increased hematocrit brought on by acclimatization.